Hi everybody, welcome back. Last time, in considering the dispute between the railroad company and the LeRoy Fiber Company, we considered a case of low transactions costs where bargaining between the railroad and the fiber company was easy and cheap. In such a circumstance, we saw the Coase theorem applied, and it didn't matter to whom the court originally gave the property right to throw sparks in the near area of LeRoy's yard, that bargaining between the railroad and LeRoy would move that right to its highest valuing owner, in this case the railroad, and the only difference that would be created in the decision of the case for one side or the other would be the distribution of money between LeRoy and the railroad company. But what if transactions costs are high? What if it's not easy for the railroad to bargain with LeRoy? What will happen then? We've seen that the Coase theorem is endangered when transactions costs are high. Here we'll talk about an example that shows what might occur, what might come about in a case of high transactions costs. So, we'll assume in this case, rather than there being just one LeRoy with whom the railroad has to bargain, there are 100 LeRoy fiber companies, each of them identical, each of them spaced out perhaps by a mile in the area between Chicago and Minneapolis. So, as you can see on the slide, I've drawn 100 LeRoy fiber companies, each lying along the track, so that the railroad must now come to terms not with just one of them over the purchase of the right to throw sparks, but to purchase that right from all of them. We'll start off with a couple of assumptions, beginning with the assumption that, in order to create the need for transactions, we'll assume that a court has already given the property right to throw sparks in the near area of each of the 100 LeRoy's yards to the LeRoy companies themselves. That means that if the railroad is going to come to terms with the LeRoy companies, it must buy the right to throw sparks into the near area of each of their yards. So we'll start with a couple of other assumptions. The first of these assumptions is that for each of the 100 LeRoys along the way, the same values exist between the railroad and the LeRoy companies as existed in our earlier example. That is, for each of the LeRoy fiber companies along the line, the LeRoy companies value the property right to have sparks thrown on the near area of their yards at $1,000, and the railroad places a value on each of those 100 property rights of $5,000 for each of them. And we'll assume again that all of the LeRoys are identical, and these values characterize every potential transaction between the railroad and the LeRoys. So, as you can see, the total value to the railroad of having the property right to throw sparks in all 100 of the LeRoy yards is $500,000, and the total value of the property rights to the LeRoy companies taken together is $100,000, and thus, obviously, the railroad is the higher valuing owner of all of these rights, and if bargaining were free, it would get those rights through transactions with the LeRoy companies one at a time. Let's, however, make a second assumption which really adds the complicating feature to the problem. Let's assume, either for legal reasons or for technical reasons, that the railroad cannot divert its track around individual recalcitrant LeRoy companies. That is, if one LeRoy company fails to come to terms with the railroad has no option to simply avoid that LeRoy company's yard after having come to terms with all of the other LeRoys. We'll say either that the railroad has no technical ability to do this, or for some reason or other there is some legal impediment to their doing this. This means that the railroad must come to terms with all 100 of the LeRoy companies, or indeed it can't do business at all. So the success of the project under this assumption requires LeRoy to successfully complete a transaction for the relevant property rights with each and every one of the LeRoys, and if it fails to come to terms with any of the LeRoys, the whole project will need to be scrapped. My friend, the economist Thomas Maselli, has coined the term assembler to describe the situation which the railroad finds itself in, and in real life there are many people who find themselves in a similar position of being an assembler. Indeed, later in the course, we'll talk a little bit about eminent domain, and eminent domain is primarily a response to the problem that we're talking about now, where a developer typically needs to purchase property from very large numbers of people, but must have the property of each of those people in order to complete the project. What this means in our LeRoy example is that each LeRoy company is a monopolist. That is, each of them has a property right that the railroad needs to buy, and the railroad can't proceed with its project until it comes to terms with the particular LeRoys that hold the property rights that it needs. There's nobody else from whom the railroad can buy those property rights. It must deal with these LeRoys or with no one. And this creates a problem for the railroad because strategic behavior on the part of the LeRoys may raise the costs of bargaining between the railroad and the LeRoys so high that the railroad will be unable to complete all of the requisite transactions and thus have to scrap the project. So let's see how this might work out. Suppose, once again, we imagine all of those LeRoy fiber companies lined up along the right-of-way, one after the other. And, as the next slide shows, let's imagine that the railroad president, the president of the railroad company, gets on a handcar, one of those hand-propelled devices where somebody pumps a lever up and down, and the little car rolls along the railroad track. You can see a little cartoon of it on the slide itself. So let's suppose the president of the railroad gets on a handcar and starts to bargain with the individual LeRoys one at a time. So he starts out with the company that I've called LeRoy 1, and once again the railroad's value for the property right to throw sparks on LeRoy 1's yard is $5,000, and the property value of that property right to the LeRoy number 1 is $1,000. So there's obviously room for a deal to be made, and let's assume that it is. Let's assume that the railroad offers LeRoy number 1 $2,000 for the property right to throw sparks in that LeRoy's yard. What this means is that then the railroad can, once it completes the project, drive its trains past LeRoy's lot, LeRoy number 1's lot, throw the sparks into the lot, for which it has paid $2,000. Because it earns $5,000 from that particular activity, the railroad winds up with a $3,000 surplus. That is to say, the value of the property right, $5,000, to the railroad is $3,000 greater than the price that the railroad has actually had to pay to LeRoy number 1 to get that property right. LeRoy number 1 has realized a surplus too because he's lost a right that he valued at $1,000, but in return for that right, the railroad has paid him $2,000, and so the $1,000 damages done to his lot are compensated, and LeRoy number 1 has an extra $1,000 to assuage the pain of the deal. So, after this first deal, we can imagine that the railroad takes its $3,000 of surplus and figuratively puts it in a can to collect all the surpluses. So, having successfully completed the first deal, the railroad president gets on his handcar and pumps his way to LeRoy number 2, where the values involved are the same as they were with LeRoy number 1. So let's assume that the railroad president is able to make a deal with the second LeRoy company on exactly the same terms that he's made a deal with the first LeRoy. That is, the railroad buys the right to throw sparks in LeRoy 2's lot for the same $2,000 price that the railroad had paid to LeRoy number 1. Once again, the railroad realizes a $3,000 surplus, which we'll figuratively throw into the surplus can, where there are now $6,000 of the railroad surplus having been collected, and LeRoy number 2 is satisfied, having been given $2,000 in exchange for a property right that the second LeRoy valued only at $1,000. So everything is going smoothly, and the railroad president gets back into his into his handcar and drives to Leroy Company number 3. But now a problem begins because Leroy number 3 has been watching the deals that have been made between the railroad and the first 2 Leroy companies. And Leroy number 3 realizes perhaps that the railroad is making a deal with each of the preceding Leroys and taking a surplus away, doesn't know exactly how much, but taking a surplus away from each of those deals. And Leroy number 3 thinks to himself, well, if I can avoid dealing with the railroad now, so that the railroad keeps making deals with some of my colleagues up and down the line without making a deal with me, then with each of those deals, the railroad will have thrown a little bit of its surplus into a little bit of the price into the can to create the surplus, and the surplus gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Since the railroad needs to get the property rights from all 100 of the Leroys, those Leroys which have held out and which haven't sold their property rights to the railroad are now in a position to be able to bargain over that large surplus that the railroad has been throwing into the can. In principle, Leroy number 3 would like to be Leroy number 100, in which case all 99 of the other Leroys will have made a deal, perhaps for $2,000, which would leave a huge surplus in the railroad's can available to be bargained over with Leroy number 100. The hope of Leroy number 100 is that the railroad, being so close to the completion of all 100 deals, and thus to the success of its railroad project, will be induced by the situation to meet Leroy number 100's demands and pay a much greater amount than the $2,000 the railroad has paid to all of the previous Leroys to this last Leroy who is holding out. Each Leroy thus has an incentive, on recognizing this situation, to withhold or conceal the information that it has about its own true valuation of the property right to throw sparks in its own yard. If some of the Leroys simply lie to the railroad company and say, well, no, the value that we place on that property right is not just $1,000, as our colleagues earlier in the line have agreed, we believe that the property right is worth $3,000 or $5,000 or $10,000 to us, and we won't sell that property right to you until you pay us the price that we're asking. Every Leroy has a similar incentive to be the last Leroy to come to terms with the railroad, because the last Leroy who comes to terms with the railroad will have the opportunity to bargain over a much larger surplus than that Leroy would have been able to bargain over had the Leroy come to a deal with the railroad somewhat earlier. Because all 100 of the Leroy lots have the same incentive. As the railroad president moves his car from lot to lot to lot, each owner will tell the railroad company president to move on to the next Leroy, make a deal with him, and when you've made a deal with all 99 of the other Leroy companies, come back to me and make a deal with me. Since all of them are making the same claim and the same threat, as it were, to the railroad company, none of the deals in principle will take place, and a project which would have been in the best interests of both the railroad and, truthfully, each of the 100 Leroy companies will be frustrated by the strategic behavior of the Leroys, who are all trying to avoid making precisely the deal that would be in their self-interest because they're holding out for an even better deal.
So, this is a variant of what economists call the hold-up problem. Every Leroy has the incentive to be the last one to come to terms with the railroad, because if they're the last ones, then they're in a position to bargain over the largest surplus. And so, because of this incentive, every Leroy tries to become the last Leroy to bargain with the railroad, and so they all stall and refuse to bargain, and the railroad is unable to make any of the deals that it would have made and which would have been mutually beneficial not just to the railroad, but to all of the LeRoys as well. What we've seen is that absent this holdup problem, the company could make a deal with each and every one of those LeRoys because each and every one of those LeRoys is a lower valuing owner of the relevant property right than the railroad is. But the holdup problem means that people have an incentive, the LeRoys have an incentive not to come to terms with the railroad until everybody else has come to terms with the railroad, which means that bargaining will not take place, and therefore those gains in economic value that could have been realized by the 100 separate transactions will not be undertaken. The transactions will not be undertaken, and so those gains in economic value will not be realized. So a decision for the railroad along Holmes's lines, that is to say, a decision that grants to the railroad a property right to throw sparks from carefully operated trains onto LeRoy's yard, makes all of the transactions that the railroad would have to undertake with the LeRoys, had the LeRoys been granted the property right initially, unnecessary. Because, under Holmes's rule, the railroad, the higher valuing property owner, would have been given the property right in the first instance, and therefore no transaction, and therefore no attendant transactions costs, would be necessary in order to move those property rights from a lower valuing owner until the higher valuing owner. And so Posner, in this case, would agree with Holmes by saying if transactions costs created by the holdup problem are so large that the transactions that would be necessary to move property rights from the lower valuing LeRoys to the higher valuing railway would not be undertaken, then efficient allocation can only be realized if the court grants the relevant property right to throw sparks into the near area of LeRoy's yard to the railroad company. Of course, as I've suggested, this assumes that the court knows that the railroad is the higher valuing owner, and that's something it can only determine in terms of the evidence which is presented to it in court. So all of this suggests that efficiency can be achieved by an appropriate decision by the court, though this decision to realize efficiency, in this case, will have been made at the expense not just of one LeRoy, but of every LeRoy. That is to say, a new property right, the right to throw sparks from a carefully operated train into the near area of the LeRoy's yards, this new right would have been determined by Holmes's jury and awarded to the railroad at the expense of the LeRoy companies. The railroad would be allowed to throw sparks without fear of liability, and the LeRoys would be therefore required to take account of the railroads doing this and reorganize their yards so as to account for the sparks and thereby cost themselves some money. So efficiency would be achieved by the application of Holmes's rule and Posner's corollary in this case, but it would be done perhaps at the expense of justice if we believe that justice required that the railroad buy the right from the LeRoys. If we sympathize with the LeRoys, if we think that justice requires that they have the right to profit from the railroad's tossing of sparks in their yard, then Holmes's rule would do an injustice. If, on the other hand, we believe that justice is not something that courts can do easily or fairly, that is, that justice can't be done in an unarbitrary way, then efficiency provides a standard on which all sides can agree if the court is correct in determining who the highest valuing property owner is. And so, Posner's corollary, as you can see, has great practical significance in the real world where transactions costs are high. Where transactions costs are high, Posner shows, efficient allocation of property rights can only be achieved if the higher valuing owner is given the property rights for free in the initial allocation by the court. But this may do distributional injustice by giving a property right to the higher valuing owner for free and thereby denying the lower valuing owner of the property right the opportunity to share in the profits or the value that will accrue to the higher valuing owner from that owner's possession of the property right itself. In the next lecture, we'll talk about these distributional concerns more explicitly in a case where transactions costs are very low.